In the summer of 1942, the world stood on a knife's edge. Across the breadth of Europe, Hitler's armies held dominion over the continent. France lay shackled under occupation, its northern ports converted into fortresses of steel and concrete. To the east, the Soviet Union was bleeding at Stalingrad, and along the Volga, its armies desperate for relief. And in London, behind the blacked-out windows of the War Cabinet rooms, Winston Churchill faced a grim question. How long could Britain and her allies afford to wait before striking back at Nazi-occupied Europe? The answer for the planners of combined operations would come in the form of a single daring raid. It would be a test of strength, a rehearsal for a greater invasion yet to come, and a message to both friend and foe that Britain still possessed the will to fight. The target was a small French port on the Channel coast, Dieppe. The decision to strike there was born out of both pressure and necessity. By 1942, Stalin's armies were engaged in a life-and-death struggle on the Eastern Front, demanding that the Western Allies open a second front to divide Germany's might. Churchill, cautious but sympathetic, knew the British military was not yet ready for a full-scale invasion, but he also knew that inaction could fracture the fragile alliance. Something had to be done, not to win the war in a day, but to prepare for the day that would win the war. Operation Jubilee, as it was eventually codenamed, began as a concept months earlier under the direction of Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations. Mountbatten was a visionary of unconventional warfare, a man who believed the future of victory lay in speed, surprise, and technology. His staff had already studied the failure of earlier coastal raids and the lessons of Dunkirk, how to land, how to fight, and crucially, how to withdraw before German reinforcements could arrive. The raid on Dieppe would combine all these lessons into a single test, one intended to gauge not only enemy strength but Allied readiness. The plan was deceptively straightforward. A force of roughly 6,000 men, the majority drawn from Canada's 2nd Infantry Division, would land on the beaches just before dawn. 2 British Commando units would strike flank positions to neutralize German gun batteries, while naval forces would shell the town from the sea. The entire operation was intended to last no more than 9 hours. Troops would storm ashore, seize the port, gather intelligence, destroy key facilities, and withdraw before the enemy could react in force. But beneath the simplicity of the plan lay a network of complications. Dieppe was no isolated village. It was a heavily fortified port town, backed by high cliffs and overlooked by machine gun emplacements and artillery batteries. The Germans had converted the seafront into a killing ground of wire, concrete, and steel. Any assault would be costly, and to make matters worse, there would be no element of surprise. The channel was narrow, and German radar was ever watchful. Still, the operation pressed forward. Mountbatten's Combined Operations Headquarters coordinated with the Royal Navy, the Army, and the Royal Air Force in a joint effort unlike any attempted before. The raid would be a laboratory of war, testing amphibious landings, close air support, radar coordination, and even the newly designed landing craft that would one day storm the beaches of Normandy. Every service had something to learn from Dieppe. In the air, the Royal Air Force prepared its largest single-day commitment since the Battle of Britain. Fighter commands, Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons would escort bombers, strafe targets, and duel the Luftwaffe over the French coast. For the first time, American airmen flying with the RAF's Eagle squadrons would join in the fight. On the sea, destroyers and gunboats would deliver the troops across 30 miles of open water. The operation would be a test of total coordination, and its success depended on timing down to the minute. As the final plans took shape in July 1942, optimism mingled uneasily with doubt. The intelligence on Dieppe's defences was limited. The German order of battle was not fully known. Yet political pressure weighed heavily. Churchill himself believed that a major raid was essential, if not strategically, then symbolically. Britain needed to demonstrate resolve to its allies, its enemies, and to its own weary people. Among those preparing were the men of the Canadian 2nd Division. For 2 years they had trained in Britain, awaiting a chance to prove themselves. Dieppe would be their baptism of fire. Veterans recalled the sense of purpose mixed with tension as orders filtered down. Some were eager, others wary. "We knew it wasn't going to be a picnic," one Canadian corporal later said, "but we were young and ready." In the weeks leading up to the raid, training intensified. Mock landings were staged along the English coast. Troops drilled endlessly in boarding procedures, urban fighting, and beach assaults. Naval gunners practiced bombardments in the Channel. Meanwhile, RAF squadrons rehearsed large-scale operations to provide the dense air cover that would be essential for the landing success. Every component, air, land and sea, was woven together under Mountbatten's oversight, a tapestry of precision that on paper promised victory. Yet fate has little regard for plans. Early rehearsals revealed difficulties coordinating timing between naval convoys and air support. Weather and tides introduced further challenges. In mid-July, an initial attempt to launch the operation, under its earlier codename Rutter, was cancelled due to poor weather and security concerns. Some intelligence officers argued for postponement until autumn, but by August, the political and strategic momentum behind the raid had become unstoppable. By the evening of the 18th of August 1942, the English Channel was alive with movement. Over 250 ships, from sleek destroyers to crowded landing craft, assembled in darkness along the southern coast of England. Troops whispered final letters home. Mechanics fueled Spitfires and loaded ammunition belts. Pilots checked their maps and altimeters under the glow of red lamps. The operation's code word had gone out. Operation Jubilee was underway. At 3 a.m., the convoys left the English coast, cutting through calm seas toward France. Above them, the low rumble of aircraft engines grew as the first RAF squadrons took to the air. Somewhere across the Channel, German radar operators were already tracking the disturbance. On the cliffs above Dieppe, sentries peered into the black horizon, unaware that within hours the sky and sea would erupt into one of the fiercest one-day battles of the war. As the Allied armada advanced through the night, its soldiers and airmen carried the weight of an empire's hope. None could know how history would remember what they were about to attempt as failure, sacrifice, or the costly rehearsal for triumph yet to come. The raid on Dieppe had begun, and with it, the opening act of the long road back to Europe. Dawn was still hours away when the lights burned late inside Combined Operations Headquarters. Maps of the French coastline stretched across long oak tables, their edges curling under the heat of cigarette smoke and tension. Red and blue pins marked landing zones, enemy gun emplacements, and the tide schedules that would determine success or disaster. The men around the table, soldiers, sailors, and airmen, were bound by one urgent purpose: to turn the Dieppe concept into a plan of action that could actually work. The codename was now official: Operation Jubilee. On paper, it appeared almost elegant in its precision. 6,000 men would strike a single port, destroy its defences, gather intelligence, and withdraw before the Germans could bring their full strength to bear. In reality, it was a tightrope walk between boldness and catastrophe. The ground force would be a coalition of nationalities. At its heart stood the Canadian 2nd Infantry Division under Major General J. H. Roberts. For the young nation of Canada, this would be the first large-scale operation of the war conducted under its own flag. Many of its soldiers had been in Britain since 1939, training endlessly while the war raged elsewhere. Dieppe would be their long-awaited chance to prove themselves, though none could guess the price that proof would demand. Supporting them were Number 3 and Number 4, British Commando units, veterans of earlier coastal raids, now tasked with silencing the heavy guns that guarded the flanks of Dieppe. Each piece of the plan carried immense detail. 2 small assault groups would land before dawn east and west of the main beaches, one at Berneval, the other at Varengeville. Their job was to scale cliffs, infiltrate German gun positions, and destroy the batteries that could turn the beaches into killing fields. At the centre, the Canadians would hit Dieppe itself, a shingle beach hemmed in by cliffs and overlooked by concrete bunkers. Behind them, a fleet of destroyers and landing craft would deliver reinforcements and supplies. The Royal Navy's role was formidable. Some 250 vessels, from sleek destroyers to small motor launches, were assigned to carry and protect the invasion force. The operation would demand impeccable timing. The first landings needed to hit the beach at 4:50 a.m., with follow-up waves arriving at 10-minute intervals. Every delay risked disaster. The sea itself was a factor. The shallow tides of Dieppe could trap landing craft on the beaches if the schedule slipped by even minutes. In the skies, the Royal Air Force faced a challenge of its own. Unlike earlier raids, Jubilee required complete air coordination from the first shot to the last withdrawal. Fighter Command's 11th Group would provide top cover with more than 50 squadrons, an air armada of Spitfires and Hurricanes with a handful of Typhoons and Mustangs joining for ground attack. Bomber Command's role was limited. Allied leaders feared civilian casualties if Dieppe were heavily bombed beforehand, and the narrow harbour left little room for error. Instead, the RAF would rely on precision strikes and low-level strafing runs to suppress defences. Among those squadrons were the American volunteers of the RAF's Eagle squadrons. Young men from Texas, Ohio, and New York who had crossed the Atlantic before their own country entered the war would now fly into combat alongside their British comrades. They were confident, sometimes reckless, but admired for their daring. Their Spitfires gleamed in the twilight of English airfields as ground crews loaded ammunition belts and checked oxygen lines. To many of these pilots, Jubilee was more than a mission. It was a symbol of Allied unity finally taking flight. Across southern England, preparations unfolded in secrecy. On naval bases at Portsmouth and New Haven, landing craft were painted dark grey and camouflaged with netting. Soldiers rehearsed embarking under blackout conditions, practicing how to climb down rope ladders with full packs. Commandos sharpened their knives and studied reconnaissance photos showing the silhouette of every bunker and gun pit. Tank crews of the Royal Regiment of Canada practiced driving the new Churchill tanks up steel ramps and onto landing craft, uncertain how they would perform on a French beach under fire. The Churchill tanks were a gamble. No armoured vehicles had ever been used in an amphibious raid of this scale. To make them seaworthy, engineers modified each with waterproofing and exhaust stacks rising like chimneys. The plan was simple in theory. The tanks would land alongside the infantry, crush beach obstacles, and push into the town itself. In practice, the terrain was treacherous. Dieppe's beaches were covered in smooth pebbles that could jam treads and slow the tanks to a crawl. Some engineers voiced concerns, but the planners pressed on. The success of the raid depended on mobility and momentum. Intelligence officers briefed commanders using aerial photographs and reconnaissance reports from the French resistance. They knew the Germans had fortified the cliffs and beaches, but the full extent of their defences remained uncertain. Many of the reports were weeks old, based on limited overflights. Analysts estimated that around 1,500 German troops garrisoned the area, primarily from the 302nd Infantry Division. What they could not confirm was how quickly reinforcements might arrive from nearby Rouen or Abbeville once the alarm sounded. Within the command structure, there was debate. Some senior officers questioned the wisdom of a direct assault on a defended port. Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, who had overseen the Dunkirk evacuation, expressed unease over how little naval firepower could be safely committed. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory argued that the air plan was too ambitious, that the Luftwaffe would almost certainly contest the skies in force. Yet Mountbatten and Churchill believed the operation must go forward. The need for experience, for proof that the Allies could return to continental Europe, outweighed the risks. As August approached, the machinery of the operation accelerated. Supplies were stockpiled along the southern coast. Radio operators fine-tuned frequencies for naval coordination. Medical units stood ready aboard hospital ships. Every man involved was sworn to secrecy. Even the troops themselves were told only that they were training for a raid on the French coast. Only the highest commanders knew the true target. In those final days, rehearsals took on a fevered intensity. Off the Sussex coast, landing craft churned through waves during practice assaults. Commandos crept through mock German strongholds built from scaffolding and sandbags. Pilots from Biggin Hill flew sorties along the channel to familiarize themselves with the terrain. Observers noted that the mood among the Canadians had shifted from excitement to grim determination. They knew the coming fight would be no mere skirmish. Behind the scenes, unseen by most, intelligence from the codebreakers at Bletchley Park hinted at the presence of the Luftwaffe's elite JG-26 fighter group stationed near Abbeville, Adolf Galland's famed Abbeville boys. It was a warning that Dieppe would not go unchallenged, yet that information never reached every level of command in time. The machine of war was already in motion. On the evening of August 18, 1942, the invasion fleet began to assemble. Columns of landing craft gathered silently under the coastal cliffs of southern England, their decks crowded with soldiers clutching rifles, grenades, and nervous hopes. The destroyers HMS Calpe, Berkeley, and Bleasdale took their positions to escort the armada across the channel. Overhead, the final weather reports promised clear skies, ideal for the air forces that would cover the landings. By midnight, the engines were turning over, the low rumble echoing across the water. Pilots strapped into their Spitfires and Hurricanes, ready to launch before dawn. In briefing rooms, final orders were read aloud by lamplight. "The eyes of the world are upon you," General Roberts told his men, echoing words that would later resound in Normandy. "You are about to make history, Mesquis." As the flotilla slipped from the harbours into the dark sea, a thick mist rolled over the channel. To the west, the moon shimmered faintly on the waves. In the cockpits above, pilots watched their compasses and altimeters glow in the dim light, waiting for the signal to cross into enemy skies. Operation Jubilee was no longer a plan on paper. It was a living, breathing assault force moving toward France in the silence before dawn. The fate of its thousands of men, soldiers, sailors, and airmen alike, now rested on timing, luck, and the thin hope that the enemy would be caught off guard. In just a few hours, the horizon would ignite with gunfire, and the greatest one-day air and sea battle of the early war would begin. The story of Dieppe was about to unfold, one decision, one wave, and one heartbeat at a time. By the early hours of August 19, 1942, the skies over southern England thrummed with the pulse of hundreds of engines. Across a dozen airfields, men in flight jackets moved with the precision of habit, though few spoke above a mutter. The operation so carefully assembled by planners now passed into the hands of the airmen who would cover it. For the Royal Air Force, Operation Jubilee was to be a display of sheer scale, a massive commitment of air power unseen since the height of the Battle of Britain. Fighter Command's 11th Group was responsible for the operation, commanded by Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory. Under his direction, more than 70 squadrons had been assembled for the day's action. Nearly 1,000 aircraft in total, though only a fraction would ever see the beaches themselves. The force included the stalwart Spitfires, nimble Hurricanes, and newly arrived Typhoons. From the hangars of Biggin Hill to the fields of Tangmere, every pilot and ground crewman knew the name Dieppe. Each squadron was assigned a precise role. Spitfire units were to dominate the skies above the beaches, intercepting any Luftwaffe aircraft that might threaten the invasion fleet. Hurricanes were tasked with low-level attacks against German gun positions, while the rugged new Typhoons would strike radar and communications posts along the coast. Bomber Command, though limited, would contribute through tactical raids against German airfields. The 97th Bomb Group of the United States Army Air Forces, freshly arrived on British soil, was given the task of striking the Luftwaffe base at Abbeville. It would be the Americans' baptism of fire in the European theatre. For the young Americans of the RAF's Eagle squadrons, the tension was electric. They had been waiting for a major engagement since joining the British early in the war. Many had crossed the Atlantic before the United States had even entered the conflict, flying under the Union Jack while wearing their home country's pride on their sleeves. Now, stationed at Gravesend, North Weald and Biggin Hill, they prepared their Spitfires in the dark. Among them was Flight Lieutenant Don Gentile, who would later become one of America's great fighter aces. On that morning, though, he was just another pilot checking his oxygen lines, hands steady, heart racing. Around the airfields, the pre-dawn ritual followed a familiar rhythm. Mechanics crouched beneath wings, tightening bolts and checking ammunition belts. The scent of high-octane fuel and oil hung thick in the cool air. In operations huts, controllers plotted fighter routes on maps with wax pencils, while runners carried last-minute changes between squadrons. There was no noise of fanfare, only the sound of engines winding up one after another, a deep mechanical heartbeat that spread across the countryside. At Tangmere, Group Captain Douglas Bader's old command, now home to Spitfire MAC-Vs, the pilots gathered for their briefing. The tone was businesslike. Charts showed the line of approach across the channel, the precise times each formation would cross the French coast, and the points at which contact with the enemy was expected. A final reminder echoed through the room. Keep altitude, stay with your section, and remember, the army depends on you. At the same hour, miles away at Bassingbourn, the American bomber crews were running through their own checklists. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was still a novelty in British skies, a vast four-engine Leviathan compared to the smaller twin-engine bombers the RAF used for daylight missions. Crews gave their aircraft names: Memphis Belle, Yankee Doodle, Big Noise from Brooklyn, chalked across the silver fuselages as symbols of home. The men aboard were young, many barely in their 20s, their first combat flight waiting beyond the dawn. As the clock neared 4 a.m., the first fighters taxied into position. The ground crews waved lanterns to signal takeoff. One after another, the Spitfires accelerated down the runways, wheels lifting into the mist. They climbed through low cloud until the channel spread beneath them, dark, smooth and silent. The pilots could see faint glimmers of ships below, hundreds of them stretching east and west, the invasion fleet heading toward Dieppe. In their cockpits, the men adjusted their oxygen masks and watched the pale horizon for signs of movement. For those in the air, there was always the same paradox: the beauty of flight and the knowledge that death could arrive in seconds. Pilot Officer Charles Cook of 71 Squadron later recalled how serene the world looked in those first minutes over the channel. The sea was calm, the sunrise perfect, he said. You could almost forget what waited on the other side. The radio chatter remained light, clipped. Each pilot knew his call sign. each formation its altitude and vector. There was no conversation, no nervous banter, only the discipline of trained men who had practiced this countless times. To the left, the outline of the English coast began to fade. Ahead, the French shoreline loomed as a shadow under the growing light. As the fighters crossed to the French coast, the first bursts of anti-aircraft fire erupted from the cliffs. Small black puffs blossomed in the air, the unmistakable signature of German flak batteries waking to the presence of intruders. The formations broke slightly to avoid the worst of it, but the enemy's radar had already tracked them. Below, the beaches of Dieppe were coming into view, and in the distance, faint flashes marked the opening naval bombardments. Back in England, controllers followed the operation through reports coming in by radio. The communication lines buzzed with call signs and updates, coded and terse. Lee Mallory stood over the plotting table at Uxbridge, watching as small coloured markers moved across the channel map. Each marker represented a group of men now engaged in history's unfolding hour. At 5:15, the first German fighters scrambled from their bases at Abbeville and Saint-Omer. The Luftwaffe's elite JG-26, under the command of General Adolf Galland, was one of the best equipped and most battle-hardened units in the world. Their Focke-Wulf FW190s were faster and more heavily armed than most Spitfire MKVs, and their pilots were veterans of countless engagements. Within minutes, the sky above northern France would belong to chaos, but in these first moments, the Allied pilots still flew undisturbed. Many glanced down at the water below and saw the long wakes of the invasion ships slicing through the channel. From above, it was a sight few would forget. Hundreds of vessels moving in ordered formation, each carrying men who trusted that the air above them was secure. As dawn broke, the full scale of the operation became visible. The sky filled with aircraft, Spitfires weaving patrol patterns, Hurricanes diving on coastal positions, and bombers heading inland. The rising sun cast their shadows across the water like dark birds. From the cockpit of his Spitfire, Flight Lieutenant Alfred Binney of 401 Squadron described it later as the greatest spectacle of our lives. The air seemed alive with wings. To coordinate such a vast aerial ballet was an achievement in itself. Radio frequencies were split between groups, time intervals marked with ruthless precision. A delay in one section could cascade across the entire operation. Pilots were expected to hold formation to the second. One error could leave ground troops exposed. Every squadron commander understood that their mission was both shield and sword, to protect the soldiers below while battling the Luftwaffe above. By 6 a.m., the first enemy contacts appeared. German radar had drawn a clear picture of the invasion force, and Luftwaffe controllers began vectoring fighters toward the coast. On the British side, the radio crackled to life with reports. Bandits sighted, 20+, Angels 1-5. The engagement had begun. Back at Bassingbourn, the American bombers were climbing to altitude. 24 flying fortresses formed up in tight formation, engines roaring in unison. Their target was the Abbeville airfield, the heart of JG-26 operations. If the bombers could destroy or disable it, Galland's fighters would have nowhere to land, grounding much of the Luftwaffe's strength. Escorting them were 4 squadrons of Spitfires, weaving above and beside the lumbering giants. The bombers crossed to the French coast at 10,000 feet, greeted by bursts of flak that rocked their wings. The gunners kept watch from their plexiglass bubbles, scanning the horizon for enemy aircraft. To their relief, few appeared. The German fighters were still drawn toward Dieppe, where the dogfights now multiplied across the sky. The B-17s continued toward Abbeville almost undisturbed, a rare stroke of luck on a day when luck would be in short supply. At that same moment, over Dieppe itself, the aerial struggle intensified. The roar of engines blended with the thunder from the ships below. To the soldiers on the beach, the sky seemed alive with spiraling contrails and the flash of gunfire. For the pilots, the world narrowed to a blur of speed, smoke, and instinct. By mid-morning, the Allied air umbrella stretched from the beaches to 30 miles inland. The scale was immense. Over 2,500 sorties flown in a single day, the largest air engagement yet seen in the Western Front. Each squadron played its part in the unfolding storm, unaware that the battle for Dieppe was already turning grim below. As the morning sun rose higher, the air over northern France became a maelstrom of men and machines, the culmination of months of planning and years of war. For the RAF, this was the moment of truth, their greatest test since the dark days of 1940. For the soldiers below, it was the fragile promise of survival. The Allied air forces had assembled, and the battle for the skies above Dieppe had truly begun. The English Channel lay under a cloak of mist when the invasion fleet began its final approach. Engines rumbled in the still darkness, the sound muted by the damp air. To those aboard the landing craft, the voyage seemed endless, a slow crawl through grey seas and shadows, each wave tapping against steel hulls like the beat of a distant clock. Officers checked watches against synchronized signals, knowing that precision meant survival. Somewhere ahead, the French coast waited, asleep for a few moments longer. Aboard the destroyer Calpe, Rear Admiral Harold Bailey Groman watched through binoculars as the black outline of the flotilla spread across the horizon. The convoy was divided into waves, each element with a specific destination. Commandos to the flanks, Canadians in the center, tanks and engineers behind them. In theory, it was a masterpiece of coordination. In practice, every man aboard sensed the fragility of that plan. The slightest error, a mistimed landing, a navigation fault, a patrol spotted too soon, could unravel the operation before the first shot was fired. As the fleet advanced, a sense of eerie calm settled over the water. Officers spoke in low tones, soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder, faces hidden beneath helmets, the smell of oil and damp canvas heavy in the air. Some smoked silently, others clutched small photos folded inside pockets. Chaplains moved from craft to craft, offering brief words of comfort. "Remember your training," one officer said, his voice almost lost beneath the thrum of engines. "Keep your heads down until you reach the beach." Just after 3:30 a.m., that calm was broken. One of the Eastern assault groups, carrying number 3 Commando, stumbled upon a German convoy of small patrol craft. A sudden exchange of tracer fire ripped the darkness open. Red and green streaks tore across the sky, reflected in the sea below. For a moment, chaos reigned. Men shouting, engines roaring, bullets striking water in hissing arcs. Several Allied landing craft were hit, others scattered. The element of surprise, so carefully built, began to slip away. The German shore positions were now fully alert. Aboard the Western flotilla, unaware of the skirmish to the east, the commandos of number 4 were closing in on their own objective, the gun batteries at Varengeville. Their landing went more smoothly. Under cover of darkness, they approached the cliffs, their landing craft gliding silently toward the narrow beach. At the signal, ramps dropped and the men waded ashore, boots sinking into wet sand. The climb that followed was brutal, a near vertical scramble up chalk cliffs under the weight of weapons and explosives. Yet, through training and sheer determination, the commandos reached the top and fanned out across the fields. When the first light broke over the horizon, they were already among the enemy emplacements. Lieutenant Colonel Lord Lovat, commanding number 4 Commando, led the charge personally. Moving swiftly and with precision, his men stormed the gun positions, cutting through barbed wire and silencing German crews before they could react. In less than 2 hours, the Varangeville battery was in Allied hands, its guns destroyed with timed charges. A single flare arced into the sky, the prearranged signal for success. It was one of the few parts of the raid that unfolded exactly as intended. Far to the east, however, the situation was far less favourable. Number: 3 commandos' attack at Bernaville had gone disastrously wrong. The earlier clash at sea had scattered their landing craft, leaving only a fraction of their force to reach the shore. Those who did land faced immediate fire from fortified positions above the cliffs. Machine guns and mortars tore through the surf. Despite fierce resistance, small groups managed to reach the lower slopes and harass the German gunners long enough to delay them, preventing a full barrage on the central beaches. It was a desperate fight waged in isolation, but their sacrifice spared countless others further west. At 4:45 a.m., the leading elements of the Canadian 2nd Division approached Dieppe itself. The darkness was thinning to grey, and the cliffs loomed ahead like the walls of a fortress. The destroyers Barclay and Calpe opened fire with their main guns, their flashes illuminating the sea. The shockwaves rolled across the water, shaking the smaller landing craft as they pressed forward. Columns of orange light flickered on the shoreline, German batteries returning fire. Inside the landing craft, the Canadians braced themselves as shells screamed overhead. The sea, moments before a silent void, erupted into chaos. Men shouted orders over the roar of engines. The acrid smell of cordite filled the air. Machine gun tracers swept across the waves, striking water with sharp, bright impacts. The pilots of the RAF squadrons flying overhead could see the gunfire from miles away, a constellation of violence marking the French coast. At 5:20, the first wave struck the beach. The moment the ramps dropped, gunfire engulfed the shoreline. The Germans, already alert, poured machine gun fire into the landing zones from fortified bunkers embedded into the cliffs. Mortars exploded among the incoming craft, sending spray and fragments skyward. The Canadians leapt into waist-deep water, struggling forward under the weight of gear as bullets snapped past their heads. Those who reached the shingle found themselves trapped behind a wall of obstacles, barbed wire, iron stakes, and the jagged remnants of sea defences. From the cliffs above, German gunners had a perfect field of fire. Their machine guns raked the beach in long bursts, cutting through men as they tried to find cover. Officers shouted for movement, but every step forward drew another storm of bullets. The tanks, meant to provide support, were delayed. The Churchill landing craft ran aground on underwater rocks, forcing crews to disembark under heavy fire. Some tanks managed to reach the beach, but the loose pebbles jammed their tracks, immobilizing them before they could fire a shot. In the air above, RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes began strafing the German defences in an attempt to relieve pressure. They swooped low through clouds of smoke, their guns hammering at bunkers and positions hidden among the cliffs. From below, soldiers cheered at the sight, though few realized how perilous those runs were. The German flak guns, positioned deeper inland, sent streams of tracer fire skyward, filling the air with lethal geometry. One Spitfire took a direct hit and spiraled into the sea, its impact vanishing in a burst of spray. Meanwhile, communications began to falter. Radios jammed, lines were cut, and the confusion of battle spread through every level of command. From the destroyers offshore, commanders could see little through the smoke and mist. Reports came in fragmented, often contradictory. Some units were pinned down at the water's edge, others had reached the promenade only to be cut off. The plan, so carefully crafted, was dissolving under the sheer intensity of resistance. By 7 a.m., the beach was a scene of devastation. The tide had begun to rise, trapping landing craft and washing away the wounded. Medical teams struggled to tend to the injured amid constant bombardment. Yet amid the carnage, acts of remarkable bravery unfolded. Sergeant Smoky Smith of the Seaforth Highlanders led a small group through a breach in the wire, engaging enemy positions with grenades. Engineers dashed forward to clear obstacles with satchel charges, many never returning. Officers rallied scattered men into improvised squads, fighting house to house at the town's edge. To those in the sky, the full horror below was partly obscured by haze. Pilots flying cover missions saw flashes of explosions along the beach and could only imagine what was unfolding beneath the smoke. Some tried to radio warnings of enemy movements inland. Others focused on dueling the FW190s that were now swarming into the area. The air battle had become as fierce as the fight on the ground, each side locked in a deadly contest that stretched from the sea to the clouds. As the sun climbed higher, the assault began to lose its momentum. Waves of reinforcements that should have followed were either delayed or destroyed before reaching the shore. The men already on the beach were isolated, ammunition dwindling. Officers considered withdrawal, but the signals were slow, fragmented, and often lost in the chaos. For many, the choice was made for them. They were pinned down with no way back to the sea. On the western flank, Lord Lovat's commandos, having completed their mission, began pulling back toward the evacuation zone. Their success stood as a rare beacon in an operation fast unraveling elsewhere. To the east, survivors of number. 3 commando did the same, covering each other's retreat under constant fire. The Canadians at Dieppe, however, remained trapped. From the destroyers offshore, smoke obscured the coastline almost entirely. Commanders could see only the faint outlines of wrecked landing craft and burning tanks. The sea around Dieppe shimmered with oil slicks and debris. Still, the order came down to continue supporting the troops ashore until further instruction. The naval gunners resumed their bombardment, firing blind into the haze to suppress enemy positions. By 8:30 a.m., the day had entered its decisive phase. The beach was no longer an invasion site. It was a battleground of endurance, where survival hung on luck as much as courage. Above it all, the constant hum of aircraft filled the air, a reminder that the skies were as contested as the sands below. The storm had fully broken over Dieppe. The next hours would decide whether the Allied force could hold, or whether the raid would end in withdrawal and loss. For those in the air, on the sea, and pinned to the beaches, there was no turning back. The test of courage envisioned in the war rooms of London had become a fight for life on the shattered shores of northern France. By mid-morning, the sky above the channel had transformed into a whirling storm of machinery and flame. From the beaches below, where men fought and died among smoke and shattered landing craft, the roar of engines was constant. The air battle that Allied planners had predicted now erupted in full, a titanic clash between the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe that would rage for hours. It was the largest single-day air engagement of the war so far, and the fate of those on the beaches depended on its outcome. At 8 a.m., the first German formations appeared over Dieppe. Sleek shapes cut across the clouds. The Focke-Wulf FW190S of Jagdgeschwader 26, Adolf Galland's elite Abbeville boys. These were Germany's best fighter pilots, hardened by years of combat on both the western and eastern fronts. They flew with a calm precision that came from thousands of flight hours, their confidence born of mastery. Below them, scattered formations of Spitfires began to climb to intercept, their engines screaming as they clawed for altitude. For the RAF pilots, the day's work had already begun hours earlier. Many had flown multiple sorties since dawn, refueled and rearmed in frantic bursts before taking to the air again. Now the call came through the radios, enemy fighters inbound from the southeast. Within minutes, the sky over the beaches became a deadly dance of pursuit, break, and dive. Tracers crisscrossed the morning light, the smoke trails of burning aircraft curling downward toward the sea. Flight Lieutenant Don Gentile of the 133rd Eagle Squadron was among the first to engage. His Spitfire caught sight of a formation of WW2s diving towards the fleet offshore. He banked hard and fired a burst, the shells streaking into one of the German planes and shattering its canopy. The Focke-Wulf rolled over and plunged into the water below, a brief flash marking its end. Seconds later, Gentile was in the sights of another. The dogfights spiraled from high altitude to near sea level, a layered vortex of combat where every second demanded instant decision. From the ground, the pilots seemed to vanish and reappear within the shifting cloud banks. German flak guns tracked them relentlessly, filling the air with black puffs that burst like thunderheads. Spitfires rolled through the explosions, streaking smoke and debris behind them as they passed through curtains of shrapnel. The noise was deafening, the overlapping thunder of cannon fire, engines and bombs striking the cliffs. Farther inland, more waves of German fighters scrambled from airfields at Amiens and Rouen. The Luftwaffe's coordination was swift and disciplined. Within the first hour, over 100 German aircraft converged on the Dieppe sector. In response, the RAF threw everything it had into the fight. Squadron after squadron entered the fray, number 71, 121, and 401 among them, covering the beachhead, intercepting bombers and dueling German fighters over the rooftops of the burning town. The Canadian troops below could see the battle raging directly above them. Between bursts of gunfire, they glanced upward at the twisting contrails and flashes of light where Spitfires and Focke-Wulfs tangled. To those on the ground, it was both terrifying and inspiring. A duel of titans fought within sight of the shoreline. Every tracer that crossed the sky was a lifeline of sorts, a reminder that the RAF still held the air. For the pilots, the battle unfolded in moments that stretched into eternity. Sergeant George Drake of No. 411 Squadron later described the experience in his diary. "You don't think about the size of it. You think about the next second, about where the sun is, where the enemy is, and whether your guns will fire when you pull the trigger." At 9:30 a.m., the battle intensified. Waves of FW-19 swept down through the clouds to target the ships supporting the invasion. Their cannons raked the decks of British destroyers, scoring hits that sent fountains of seawater into the air. The destroyer Calpe was struck near the bow, its deck scarred and twisted by shrapnel. Anti-aircraft gunners returned fire with ferocity, their barrels glowing red from the heat. The air between ship and sky became a net of lead. Spitfire squadrons swooped in to intercept, engaging the FW-190s head-on. In one fierce exchange, squadron leader Bill Williams of 121 Squadron led his section in an attack against a formation of 12 German fighters. His first pass broke the enemy's formation, but in the counterattack, 5 of his own aircraft were lost. For the surviving pilots, there was no time to grieve. The battle was continuous, rolling endlessly from one engagement to the next. High above the beaches, other duels unfolded beyond sight of the ships. Squadron leader Geoffrey North of 401 Squadron chased a Messerschmitt Bf-109 through the clouds, firing in short bursts until the German fighter burst into flames and tumbled earthward. Nearby, another pilot in a Spitfire Mark V found himself pursued by 2 FW-190s. His evasive dive carried him so low that waves splashed against his undercarriage before he pulled up. The level of skill and instinct required to survive such moments bordered on the superhuman. While the fighters tangled, bomber crews entered the battle zone. The RAF sent in Boston and Blenheim bombers to strike German reinforcements approaching the coast. Protected by Spitfire escorts, they roared through a wall of flak and released their bombs on troop convoys and fuel depots. The explosions rippled across the countryside, plumes of smoke rising to merge with the dark clouds over Dieppe. Each strike was meant to buy the men on the beaches another hour of survival. Amid the fury, the toll on both sides mounted. Pilots fought until their ammunition was gone, then dove for home through skies still alive with gunfire. Some limped back to England with fuel lines shot through and wings shredded, landing on one wheel or skidding across the grass. Others never returned, their aircraft vanishing into the sea or crashing in flames along the French coast. Over the course of the day, the RAF would lose nearly 100 aircraft, more than in any single day since the Battle of Britain, yet the Luftwaffe's losses would be almost as severe. At 10:15, the sound of the engines above the beaches was nearly constant. The air seemed alive, vibrating with the movement of hundreds of machines. Civilians in nearby French towns watched from rooftops as the sky burned and shattered with the sound of war. For many, it was the first time since 1940 they had witnessed such scale of fighting. It was as if the heavens themselves were tearing apart, one survivor from Dieppe later said. In the midst of that chaos, coordination remained a near miracle. RAF controllers in southern England guided incoming squadrons by radio, vectoring replacements toward the fight while recovering those running low on fuel. Ground stations tracked positions on plotting boards marked with coloured pins that moved like the hands of a clock. Every rotation represented lives in motion, each one at risk with every minute that passed. For the pilots still in combat, fatigue set in. Hours of flying and constant manoeuvring pushed muscles and minds to their limits. Sweat pooled beneath flight suits, the inside of cockpits stifling despite the high altitude. Some pilots blacked out during sharp turns, only to recover seconds before disaster. The sheer physical strain of the fight was as punishing as the enemy's bullets. As midday approached, the RAF's effort began to show results. The relentless sorties had forced the Luftwaffe to split its strength, diverting fighters from other regions to reinforce the Dieppe sector. German bombers attempting to strike the fleet were intercepted and driven off, while their ground command struggled to maintain contact amid the chaos. Though the price was high, Allied control of the air over the beaches was holding, barely. Below, the soldiers still trapped at Dieppe could sense the shift. The air above them, once dominated by the howl of enemy fighters, now hummed with the sound of Spitfires circling in defense. The presence of those aircraft offered a fragile comfort amid the wreckage and smoke. For the men on the ground, every streak across the sky meant someone was still fighting for them. As the afternoon drew closer, the battle began to move inland. The German fighters, low on ammunition and fuel, turned toward their bases, pursued by Allied aircraft. Over the channel, damaged planes limped home in twos and threes, some landing safely, others crashing into the sea within sight of rescue boats. The day's fighting had drained both sides, but the Allies had achieved what they needed most: sustained air cover over the invasion zone. By noon, the great dogfight was beginning to ebb. The skies, once a furious storm of motion and light, began to quiet. Trails of smoke lingered in long broken spirals across the horizon. The surviving pilots returned to their bases, many landing with empty tanks and torn wings. Mechanics met them on the runways, counting bullet holes and patching what they could before the next sortie was called. The air battle over Dieppe had been an inferno, a collision of courage, precision, and loss played out across the heavens. In those hours, men from Britain, Canada, and America had given everything to shield the invasion below. The cost had been immense, but their effort had bought time for the battered forces on the beach to regroup, retreat, or survive another hour under the iron sky. Above the smoke and ruins, the echo of their engines faded into silence. The dogfight over Dieppe had ended, but the day's reckoning was far from over. The fate of the raid, and of the men still trapped on those blood-soaked stones, would soon be decided. While the skies above Dieppe thundered with the clash of Spitfires and Fokker-Wulfs, another mission unfolded miles inland, one whose precision and courage would mark a new era in aerial warfare. The 97th Bomb Group of the United States Army Air Forces, newly arrived in Britain, had been tasked with a daring daylight raid on the Luftwaffe's fighter base at Abbeville. The outcome of their strike would shape the battle raging on the coast below, for Abbeville was the beating heart of German air power in northern France, home to Jagdgeschwader 26, the famed Abbeville boys. At 9 o'clock that morning, 24 Boeing B-17 flying fortresses assembled over the English countryside. From above, they appeared like silver arrows gliding through the high haze, each one a fortress in the sky, bristling with machine guns. Their mission was simple in words, but monumental in risk: cripple the airfield that was launching Gallen's deadly fighters toward Dieppe. Escorting them were 4 squadrons of Spitfires, weaving through the higher altitudes like swift guardians. Inside each B-17, the atmosphere was tense but focused. The airmen moved through the narrow fuselages, checking ammunition belts and oxygen lines. In the nose, bombardiers crouched over their Norden bomb sights, the secret precision devices believed to make daylight accuracy possible. Over the intercom, the pilots' voices crackled with calm professionalism, masking the unease that came with flying deep into enemy territory for the first time. The engines drummed in rhythmic harmony as the formation climbed through layers of cloud. Outside, the sunlight glinted on aluminum skins, casting moving reflections across the wings. From the cockpit of the lead bomber, Captain Paul Tibbets, who would later become a legendary figure in aviation history, monitored his instruments and radioed the formation to tighten spacing. The B-17s flew in a box formation designed for defense, each machine covering the blind spots of the others with its overlapping arcs of gunfire. Below, the channels stretched wide and silent, the same waters that moments earlier had echoed with war. The bombers crossed the coast near Le Tréport at 20,000 feet, invisible to those fighting below, but tracked instantly by German radar. Within minutes, anti-aircraft batteries along the coastline came alive. Bursts of flak erupted in black clouds around the formation, each detonation shaking the aircraft violently. The bombers pressed on, their wings flexing under the shockwaves. Inside the lead ship, the crew braced against the concussions. The navigator's map quivered under his hands as he called out bearings, his voice steady despite the chaos outside. "Hold course 172 degrees, 2 minutes to target area." The gunners watched for enemy fighters, their eyes scanning the sky for the grey shapes of FW-19OEs, but for now, none appeared. Many of Gallen's pilots were still engaged over Dieppe, leaving Abbeville's defences thin. The Americans were alone in the sky, and it was their moment. The formation descended slightly to bombing altitude. The airfield came into view, 3 long runways forming a triangle surrounded by hangars, fuel depots, and aircraft revetments. Through his bomb sight, Lieutenant Joe Craig could see vehicles moving on the ground. Trucks racing between shelters, crews scrambling to ready fighters that would never take off. He aligned the crosshairs and waited for the steady tone in his headset. The world outside narrowed to the thin lines of light in his sighting glass. "Bombs away!" At that command, the bell rang through the aircraft. The bomb bay doors yawned open, and the first wave of ordnance fell free. Dozens of 500-pound bombs tumbled downward in perfect sequence, their fins spinning, sunlight glinting on their casings before they disappeared into the smoke rising below. Seconds later, the shockwaves hit, rolling bursts that shook the air and rippled through the cloud cover. From the formation above, the crews could see fire erupting across the airfield. The first strike obliterated the southern runway, tearing it open like a wound. Storage tanks burst into flames, sending columns of black smoke into the sky. Hangars collapsed inward, their frames twisted by the impact. Ground personnel scattered in panic, caught in the open as explosions leapt across the tarmac. The second formation followed immediately, its own bomb load walking up the length of the remaining runway. The precision was astonishing. The craters ran in a straight line, each blast merging into the next, until the airfield resembled a ploughed field of fire and debris. From the cockpit of the lead B-17, Captain Tibbets watched the destruction unfold with grim satisfaction. The bombardiers had done their work flawlessly. Over the intercom came the confirmation. Direct hits confirmed. Runways disabled. Smoke visible to 20,000. Yet the mission was not over. As the bombers turned for home, the flak intensified. German gunners, now fully awake, tracked the departing formation with ruthless accuracy. Shells burst so close that fragments tore through fuselage skins and rattled through the compartments like gravel. A near miss slammed into one of the tail sections, shredding fabric and sending a shower of sparks through the air. The tail gunner, covered in oil and smoke, continued firing into empty sky, his voice hoarse from shouting reports into the intercom. Still, the formation held. The disciplined geometry of the B-17s was their salvation. Wounded aircraft stayed in place, supported by the guns of their neighbours. Tracer lines arced upward from the countryside as smaller flak batteries joined in, but the bombers were already climbing towards safety. Behind them, the wreckage of Abbeville burned unchecked, a rising pillar of smoke marking one of the first successful American daylight raids in Europe. For the crews, the journey home was as harrowing as the attack itself. Over the channel, the weather had worsened, forcing the formation through dense fog. Visibility dropped to near zero, and the aircraft relied entirely on radio navigation to find the English coast. The pilots spoke sparingly, voices low and controlled. Each man aboard knew the dangers. A mid-air collision in the fog could undo everything they had achieved. At last, the clouds broke. Below them lay the familiar green fields of Kent, dotted with white chalk roads and small towns. The sense of relief was overwhelming. As they approached their bases at Polebrook and Bassingbourn, the bombers broke formation and descended through the haze, wheels locking down as they lined up for landing. Ground crews stood ready, scanning the sky for the returning silhouettes. One by one, the fortresses touched down, tires screeching against the wet runways. When the engines finally wound down, silence settled across the airfields, a silence heavy with fatigue and disbelief. Mechanics rushed forward to inspect the damage. Many aircraft were scarred and pierced, their skins peppered with holes from shrapnel, yet all 24 had returned. For the first time, American heavy bombers had flown into occupied France in daylight, struck their target with precision, and made it home intact. It was a moment of triumph amid a day otherwise steeped in blood. Intelligence officers gathered the photographs taken by onboard cameras. The images revealed the scale of the destruction. Abbeville's runways were cratered and unusable, hangars flattened, and fuel stores obliterated. 2 of the Luftwaffe's 3 main runways had been rendered useless for the remainder of the day. The German fighter command, already stretched thin by the massive battle over Dieppe, was now crippled in one of its most vital sectors. News of the success spread quickly through RAF Fighter Command. Pilots returning from the Dieppe front could see the smoke rising inland, and some later described it as a black tower in the distance, marking the work of the Americans. For many in the Allied High Command, it was a glimpse into the future of warfare, a demonstration of what coordinated strategic bombing could achieve. As the afternoon light lengthened across southern England, the surviving crews gathered for debriefing. The men looked exhausted, faces smeared with oil and sweat, eyes red from strain. They spoke quietly about the mission, the close calls, and the sight of the airfield erupting beneath them. One navigator summed it up simply: it was like watching the enemy's lungs collapse. Every plane they couldn't fly today meant someone lived longer at Dieppe. For those on the beaches, that truth was invisible. They could not know that miles inland, an American strike had bought them precious time, grounding the very squadrons that might have turned the battle's tide even more decisively against them. Yet in the larger war, the raid carried enormous significance. It proved that precision daylight bombing was not a fantasy. It was a weapon. When night fell, the last B-17 mechanics wiped their hands on rags stained with oil and blood, then looked skyward. The smoke from Abbeville's destruction still drifted faintly across the horizon, carried by the wind toward the sea. The Americans had done their part. The lessons of the day, coordination, precision, and courage, would echo far beyond the burning fields of France. In the chaos of the Dieppe raid, the strike on Abbeville stood as a moment of calculated success, a rare point of triumph amid the tragedy. Above the wreckage and loss, it signaled a new chapter in the war, one where the sky itself would become the decisive battlefield. By the time the afternoon sun slanted across the channel, the beaches of Dieppe had become a graveyard of ambition. Smoke hung low over the shattered promenade, drifting inland in grey veils that mingled with the acrid scent of burning fuel. The tide had risen and fallen, reclaiming the broken landing craft that now bobbed half-submerged in the shallows. On the water's edge lay wrecks of Churchill tanks, their turrets at odd angles, treads locked by pebbles and fire. The dream of seizing the port had vanished. What remained was survival. Rear Admiral Bailey Groman stood on the bridge of HMS Calpe, eyes fixed on the coastline through binoculars smeared with salt spray. His ship's decks were scorched from near misses, the smell of cordite still clinging to the metal. Through the drifting haze, he could make out flashes of gunfire from the seafront, the last desperate shots of isolated Allied units clinging to the rubble of Dieppe. He turned to his signal officer and gave the order few commanders ever wished to utter: prepare for withdrawal. The message was relayed through radio and signal lamps, spreading from destroyer to landing craft across the invasion zone. The plan that had been executed with such precision that morning now unravelled into a rescue operation under fire. Engines roared to life as crews swung their bows toward the shore, braving enemy artillery to retrieve the remnants of the force that had stormed the beaches at dawn. On the shoreline, Canadian and British troops crouched behind shattered sea walls, their uniforms coated in grit and blood. Many had been fighting for hours without food or water, their ammunition running dangerously low. The officers moved along the line, steadying men who looked more like ghosts than soldiers. A few still returned fire toward the cliffs, where the German guns continued their merciless barrage. Amid the wreckage, Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt of the South Saskatchewan Regiment rallied his men across the Sai River under withering fire, holding a fragile bridgehead that allowed pockets of troops to retreat. His calm commands and fearless crossings earned him the Victoria Cross that day, though he never spoke of it afterward. In those final hours, individual valour became the only currency that mattered. Farther east, small groups of commandos covered the withdrawal. At Puis and Pourville, men from the Royal Regiment of Canada and the Essex Scottish were trapped against the sea, hemmed in by cliffs and machine gun nests. Each attempt to reach the boats was met with devastating fire. The pebble beaches that had been so carefully chosen for landing now turned into obstacles of death, the loose stones slipping underfoot as soldiers carried the wounded toward the surf. From offshore, naval gunners tried to provide covering fire. The destroyers Berkeley and Calpe edged dangerously close to the coast, their guns thundering in rapid succession. The recoil jolted through their hulls, sending shockwaves across the deck as shell after shell arced toward German positions. Yet even this support came at a cost. Berkeley took a direct hit from coastal artillery, her hull split by an explosion that sent sailors tumbling into the sea. Other ships maneuvered in to pull survivors from the burning water, their decks slick with oil and blood. In the air, the RAF was still locked in combat. Though the dogfight over Dieppe had begun to subside, fighter squadrons continued to patrol the skies, strafing German strongpoints to cover the evacuation. From above, pilots could see the chaos below, the rising smoke, the flashes of artillery, the bodies littering the shore. The sight was haunting. Flight Lieutenant George Screwball Burling of the RCAF, circling at 15,000 feet, later said the scene looked like the end of the world. Shortly after 11 a.m., the withdrawal began in earnest. Landing craft darted towards the beaches through plumes of smoke, machine guns chattering from the cliffs as bullets tore through the air. Crews reached the shore only to find soldiers reluctant to leave wounded comrades behind. In many places there was no time for choice. The incoming tide and enemy fire left seconds to decide who would be taken and who would remain. Men hauled each other aboard, hands slick with salt and blood, as officers shouted to make room for more. Aboard one landing craft, Sergeant George Chamberlain of the Essex Scottish recalled dragging 3 injured men across the deck while shells erupted around them. The craft's coxswain screamed for speed, throttling the engine to full power as waves broke over the bow. Behind them, the beach receded into a storm of smoke and flame. It was like leaving part of yourself behind, Chamberlain wrote later. Everything we had, our friends, our hope, was on that shore. As the evacuation intensified, naval coordination became a desperate balancing act. Destroyers maneuvered under constant bombardment, their officers calculating how close they could risk approaching the beach without grounding. Hospital ships stood farther offshore, prepared to receive the wounded ferried out by smaller craft. The scene was one of organized chaos, smoke, shouting, and the shriek of shells overlapping in an unrelenting crescendo. By early afternoon, it was clear that large portions of the landing force could not be saved. Many units were too deeply pinned or too cut off to reach the extraction points. Those still fighting in the town centre were surrounded, their ammunition nearly spent. German reinforcements had poured into Dieppe from Rouen and Abbeville, tightening the noose around the surviving Canadians. Realizing that further attempts to rescue them would only lead to more deaths, the Naval Command reluctantly issued the final order, all remaining vessels to withdraw. The decision was agonizing. From the decks of the departing ships, men looked back toward the shoreline where their comrades still fought or lay wounded. The rising tide washed across the shingle, erasing the footprints of those who had come ashore that morning. The last landing craft to leave the beach carried a handful of exhausted commandos, their faces blackened with soot, eyes hollow from shock. One of them, clutching a torn regimental flag, stared silently toward the cliffs until the coast disappeared from view. At 1 p.m., the naval guns fell silent. The thunder that had echoed across the channel since dawn faded into the low moan of the wind. The battle for Dieppe was over. In less than 10 hours, an entire division had been thrown against one of the most fortified coastlines in Europe, and the cost was staggering. Out of roughly 6,000 men who had landed, 3,623 were killed, wounded, or captured. The Royal Navy lost a destroyer and dozens of landing craft. The RAF, which had fought valiantly above, counted 88 aircraft lost, one of its worst single-day totals of the war. As the surviving ships made for England, the decks became makeshift hospitals. Medics worked frantically among the wounded, bandaging burns and setting shattered limbs. The air was filled with the smell of smoke and antiseptic. Officers moved quietly among the men, offering what comfort they could. Some soldiers stared blankly at the sea, lost in thought. Others whispered names, their voices fading into the wind. Back in Britain, word of the raid began to spread through the military command structure. Reports arrived piecemeal, first from the destroyers, then from surviving aircraft. The reality of the losses hit hard. Churchill, upon hearing the first estimates, is said to have stood in silence for several moments before muttering, "Those poor devils." Yet even in the face of disaster, the government moved swiftly to control the narrative. Official statements framed the raid as a reconnaissance in force, emphasizing the experience gained rather than the cost incurred. In the mess halls and barracks of southern England, returning soldiers were greeted as heroes, though few felt worthy of the title. The men who stumbled ashore at New Haven and Portsmouth looked hollowed out by what they had endured. Many carried the 1,000-yard stare of those who had seen too much in too little time. For the medical staff who received them, the wounds told the story: bullet scars, burns, exhaustion, and shock. The word Dieppe spread quietly among the ranks, spoken with a mixture of pride and grief. On the other side of the Channel, the German defenders surveyed the battlefield with grim efficiency. They gathered the wounded, buried the dead, and photographed the wreckage for their reports. In Berlin, the propaganda ministry seized on the failed raid as proof of Allied weakness, broadcasting triumphant claims of victory. Yet even among German officers, there was an undercurrent of respect for the bravery of the assaulting troops. One commander reportedly remarked, "If they return in such numbers again, we shall be in trouble." As dusk fell, the sea around Dieppe glowed faintly from the fires still burning along the coast. The last rays of sunlight touched the wreckage of tanks half buried in the tide, their silhouettes like monuments to a day's sacrifice. The gulls wheeled above in silence, drawn by the stillness that followed catastrophe. For those who had survived, the voyage home was quiet. The engines hummed steadily, the sound of war now replaced by the rhythm of the waves. Some men slept from sheer exhaustion, others stared into the horizon, haunted by the faces they had left behind. In the dim light of the ship's hold, a chaplain recited prayers over a covered body, his voice barely audible above the creak of the hull. The Dieppe raid had begun as an experiment in strategy and courage. It ended as a lesson written in blood across the stones of a French beach. The survivors would carry its memory with them for the rest of their lives, and the planners would soon begin dissecting every failure, searching for meaning within the ruin. From those lessons, a new plan would eventually emerge, one that would succeed where Dieppe had fallen short. As the convoy approached the English coast, the grey outline of home appeared through the mist. The men watched in silence, too tired for cheers, too changed for words. Behind them, the smoke of Dieppe drifted upward into the night, fading into history, a scar on the sea that would never entirely heal. The morning after the raid, a heavy fog hung over southern England. Along the piers of New Haven and Portsmouth, ships returned one after another, their hulls scarred and their decks littered with debris. The men who staggered down the gangways carried the weight of what they had endured. Some limped on wounded legs, others were supported by comrades, faces grey with exhaustion. Medical officers and volunteers guided them toward waiting trucks, whispering quiet words that dissolved in the chill air. The Dieppe raid was over, but its echoes were only beginning. In the War Office, maps of northern France still covered the tables. The red lines that once marked the assault plan now looked like scars across the paper. Officers studied reports as they arrived from surviving units, piecing together the scale of the disaster. The numbers were stark. More than half of the landing force lost, hundreds dead, thousands captured. The air losses were almost as heavy. Yet even as grief rippled through every level of command, there was a grim understanding that the operation had revealed truths too valuable to ignore. The lessons of Dieppe would shape the future of the war. The first realization was tactical. The planners of future invasions now had proof that direct assaults on heavily defended ports were suicidal. Dieppe's concrete seawalls and narrow approaches had turned landing craft into targets and tanks into immobile coffins. The very terrain had betrayed the attackers, the loose stones of the beach locking tracks and slowing movement to a crawl. Every decision, the landing zones, the timing, the choice of objectives, was now dissected with ruthless honesty. Out of failure came knowledge. Among the survivors, that reflection was deeply personal. In hospitals along the coast, wounded Canadians lay in neat rows beneath white sheets, their eyes fixed on the ceiling as doctors and nurses moved quietly between beds. Many spoke little, their thoughts caught between pride and sorrow. They had fought with determination and courage, only to watch their mission unravel around them. Yet even in their silence, there was no sense of defeat, only a hard-won clarity about what war truly demanded. Reports flowed steadily into London over the following days. Military engineers studied the remains of tanks and landing craft that had returned from France, noting every flaw and failure. The Churchill tanks, whose tracks had jammed in the shingle, became subjects of redesign. Engineers began experimenting with wide treads and flotation devices, innovations that would later evolve into specialized amphibious vehicles. Among them was a visionary officer named Percy Hobart, who would go on to develop the so-called Hobart's Funnies, the adapted tanks that would spearhead the beaches of Normandy 2 years later. The Navy, too, learned its lesson. The coordination between landing craft and destroyers had been insufficient, communication hampered by confusion and interference. Future operations would demand clearer lines of command and far greater emphasis on timing. The concept of naval gunfire support was redefined. No longer would small caliber shells be relied upon to silence coastal defenses. The next time the Allies landed in force, battleships and heavy cruisers would join the bombardment, ensuring that defenders were buried under overwhelming fire before the first troops touched the sand. In the skies, the Royal Air Force conducted its own introspection. The pilots who had returned from the inferno above Dieppe brought back hard truths about aerial coordination and air-ground support. Fighter Command realized that maintaining continuous air superiority over a battle zone required not just numbers, but intricate scheduling and intelligence. The Spitfires had fought valiantly, yet too many squadrons had been drawn into unplanned engagements far from the beaches. In later operations, including Normandy, the RAF and the newly formed Allied Expeditionary Air Force would refine every element, from timing of sorties to communication with ground units, ensuring a harmony between air and land that Dieppe had lacked. The Americans, too, took careful note. For the 97th Bomb Group, the success of the Abbeville raid became a beacon amid the carnage. Their precision strike had demonstrated the potential of daylight strategic bombing, a doctrine that would soon expand across Europe. Within months, American B-17 and B-24s would be flying hundreds of missions across occupied territory, crippling the industrial backbone of the Reich. Dieppe, in its tragedy, had provided the proving ground for tactics that would turn the tide of air power. Beyond the lessons of machinery and coordination, the raid forced a reckoning with the human cost of modern war. For Canada, the price was almost unbearable. Across the country, telegrams began to arrive at small-town post offices and city flats, each carrying the same stark message. In places like Winnipeg, Toronto and Vancouver, mothers, wives and children gathered in silence as the news spread. Nearly 1,000 Canadian soldiers had been killed and over 2,000 taken prisoner. Yet across the nation, sorrow soon hardened into resolve. Newspapers spoke of courage, endurance, and the promise that their sacrifice would not be in vain. The The name Dieppe became both a wound and a rallying cry. Among Allied commanders, the political ramifications were immediate. Churchill faced a torrent of criticism from Parliament and the press. Some questioned the wisdom of such an operation, accusing the government of sacrificing men for a demonstration. Churchill, characteristically defiant, argued that the raid's value lay in the hard lessons learned. For every man who fell at Dieppe, he later said, 100 will live on D-Day. Privately, he carried the burden heavily, knowing that the raid's failure would haunt him for years. The German response was equally swift. Hitler, shaken by the boldness of the Allied attempt, ordered the reinforcement of coastal defences along the entire Atlantic seaboard. His generals began constructing the Atlantic Wall, a continuous line of bunkers, minefields, and artillery positions stretching from Norway to Spain. Ironically, the raid intended to test those defences only encouraged their expansion, yet even this outcome played into the Allies' future plans. By 1944, when Operation Overlord was launched, the German command believed the enemy would once again attempt a direct assault on a major port. Normandy, with its open beaches, came as a surprise precisely because Dieppe had seemed to prove that such landings were impossible. In the months following the raid, the survivors of Dieppe returned to training. Those who had escaped capture were reorganized, re-equipped, and sent back into the endless cycle of drills and briefings. Among them were veterans who would later wade ashore at Juno Beach on June 6, 1944. For those men, the memory of Dieppe guided every decision they made. They remembered the noise of the machine guns, the futility of climbing pebbled slopes under fire, the helplessness of watching comrades fall. When the time came to strike again, they swore the outcome would be different. In the archives of combined operations, a document circulated quietly through senior command. It summarized the Dieppe experience in clinical terms, a list of tactical errors, logistical challenges, and recommendations for improvement. The tone was detached, yet beneath the language of analysis lay an unspoken acknowledgement of human courage. Those pages, later used as training material for D-Day planners, carried the blood of every soldier who had fought and fallen on that August morning. As 1943 unfolded, the lessons of Dieppe began to bear fruit. In Sicily, Allied landings were supported by relentless naval bombardment and carefully timed air cover. In Italy, engineers applied new techniques for beach landings learned from the failed raid. Each success carried within it the ghost of Dieppe, a silent reminder of the price of knowledge. Years later, veterans would gather to remember that day, in quiet halls in Ottawa, in London churches, on French soil, where the tide still whispered across the stones. They spoke of comrades lost, of courage shown in hopeless odds, and of the strange peace that followed the chaos. Some wept, others simply stared at the sea. The memory of Dieppe was not one of triumph, yet it was far from meaningless. In the end, the raid's legacy reached beyond tactics or strategy. It spoke to the resilience of men who faced impossible odds and to the capacity of nations to learn from heartbreak. From the ruins of failure rose the blueprint of victory. 2 years later, when Allied troops surged across the beaches of Normandy, many who watched from the ships remembered the faces of those who had fallen at Dieppe. The echoes of their courage carried forward, guiding every landing craft that cut through the waves on that fateful June morning. The stones of Dieppe remain today, polished by time and tide, each one bearing silent witness to that brutal experiment. The town rebuilt itself, the scars of war slowly fading beneath paint and plaster, yet the weight of memory endures. Every August, wreaths are laid along the promenade where Canadians once fought and fell. The waves lap gently against the shore, their rhythm unchanged since that distant day in 1942. In the calm that follows remembrance, one truth stands clear. From the ashes of failure, the Allies forged the tools of their greatest victory. Dieppe's legacy is written not in defeat, but in endurance, the endurance of men who faced the impossible and taught the world what it would take to reclaim a continent.